Welcome back. This is the second video on functions, and you should have reviewed the first video on functions prior to viewing this video. Let's get started. Remember earlier we were talking about vectors and arrays, and we pointed to a function in the program? Remember that? In this program, I created parallel vectors. One vector contained student names. The second vector contained those students' grades. And then I called this print student scores, which is a function, and I passed it some parameters. Students, scores, which are vectors, and the size of the vector. Notice I don't have an equals in front of this. The reason I don't have an equals, as you saw in the first video on vectors, is because this function returns nothing. That's what void means. It means I'm going to do a task, but I am not going to return anything to the caller. And the caller is the person or function, in this case main, that calls the particular function you're reviewing. So main is calling print student scores, and print student scores is called by main. But this function accepts three parameters. The first parameter is a vector type. The second parameter is also a vector type, and the third parameter is an int. So I must call print student scores with exactly three parameters. In this function, all I do is print the contents of the vectors. So really we don't need to return any value to the caller. All we're doing is printing out the vectors. Let's see this run. I will press F5. I want to run this in debug mode. So I have students and grades right now. These variables are variables of the function. They are not variables of the program main. Main, I also have a students vector and a scores vector. But as we discussed in the first video on functions, the scoping rules say that these are distinct. This vector of type strings and vector of type grades only live between the braces beginning on line 30, ending on line 35. So let's set another breakpoint here, and I will continue. And let's look at our output. Our output is, we see a student, their name, and their grade. So that's what this loop is doing. Now let's return. But before I return, let's look at our variables down here. We have a student vector, a grades vector, and size. Here's students, grades, and size. My program counter is on line 35. When I step over, I will return to the main program, which I did. Now I have finished executing this line. This student's vector is not the same student's vector from above because of scoping. Scoping says that this student's vector is only available in this function. So I have a student vector and a score vector. Notice I use different names for parameter 2. I pass a scores vector as parameter 2. Here I named it grades. That's perfectly okay. If that makes things easier for you, you can do that. If it's easier to remember the parameter name is the actual parameter that you passed in, then use the same name. It's perfectly fine. So one thing I noticed here, we really don't need the third parameter here because we know the size of a vector, right? We can always get the size of a vector by the dot size function. Let's do something to modify our program here. I'm going to stop debugging, and instead of passing this third parameter, I'm just going to delete it. So I'm only going to pass 2 parameters. Now that's an error, correct? Because I'm trying to pass 2 parameters into a function that requires 3. And in fact, we can see a little red squiggly here. But I'm going to press run just so we can see what the error is. And if I look at the error here, it says function does not take 2 arguments. And it tells me the line. If I double click on that error, it brings me right to the line. So I need to modify my print scores, print student scores. Let's modify it here, and let's just say students dot size. Now no matter what the size is of the vector, I get it right here. I'd like to direct you to the comments I have here. When you write functions, it's a good idea to have some comments. Okay? I describe what this function is going to do. However, it's not arrays, this is vectors. I'm specifying the inputs and what those inputs are. I have removed the size here. Let's remove that. And I specify what returns. Well, there is no return because it's void. Sometimes I like to add another heading here called assumptions or limitations. And in this case, there are none. But maybe you pass a vector in and the vector has to have data in it, so that would be an assumption or a limitation. The vector has to contain data. It cannot be an empty vector. Okay, so you want to always include some comments in front of your function to describe the function, list what your inputs are, and a description of those inputs, and list what the outputs are or returns. We could just call this outputs. And any assumptions you might have. Let's continue this discussion by creating a function from scratch. Okay, let's look at another program we created earlier. Remember our enumerations. I will bring that up here. We had created poker hands, remember? And we noticed that this code here is identical to this code here and here and here. So that's a duplication of code that adds a lot of maintenance, and we can make things simpler and more readable by creating a function out of that. So if we can look at what we got here, what will our return value be? If anything, do we need a return value? We could return a string and then we could just do a cout, or we could just output this and not return anything. What would be our input for this anyway? Obviously cnum. And what is cnum? Cnum is an integer, we can see from line 22. So I think a good name, an appropriate name for this function would be, I think a good name for this function should be determine number or face card value, something like that. That's a little long, but let's see what we got here. And let's go ahead and return a value. So let's return a string value, and let's call this determine num or face card value. I'm going to stick with that. And we're going to pass it an integer. And I'm going to call it card val. I'm going to put my curlies. I know based on my return value I'm going to return a string, so let's return card. Card is undefined right now, so I'm going to create a string variable called card. So I got some of my function written. You can see I have added some comments. This is called the header for the function. I have the function name, a description, what the inputs are, what the output is, which is a string representation of the card, and in this case I'm including a limitation. And I state that no error checking is performed, so I'm not going to check to make sure that 15 was not entered. I'm going to assume that the caller is passing the numbers 1 through 13. However, you should always do error checking on your inputs. So right now I know I'm going to need this part of code. I'm going to copy it, and I will put it right here. It's not CNUM. I'm going to highlight this code and replace I'm going to search for CNUM and replace that with card_val. Card_val. I'm going to replace all. I don't want to perform the cout, so I'm going to change this to card equals. And I'm just going to cut and paste this. Control C, Control V, Control V. I'm going to remove this space here. Add a space in here. Remember, white space is important. So, determine num or face card value. If the card value is 1, it's an ace. If it's an 11, it's jack, 12, queen, 13, king. Else, store the integer. So for testing, what I want to do is I will delete this code, and I need a new variable. So I will create a variable up here called card. Card equals determine. I'm going to highlight this. Once I put it in my paren, it'll tell me what I need to enter. It also tells me my header. So I got the information on what this function is going to do. All I have to do is pass the card value. So CNUM So this shows the importance of creating a header in front of every function. When you call the function, as I'm doing here, and put in my parens, it will list that header information or the comments I have for that function. So I know it's an int and it tells me everything about the function, what it does. This is CNUM. Now I have to change my cout card of clubs. So when I call determine num or face card value, it's going to store the string representation of that in card, and then it will output the string representation plus the string of clubs. So let's run this program. I'll press Control F5 to run. Control F5. And aha! This is funny. I have a little diamond. A diamond of clubs. That's interesting. Okay, so what did I do wrong? Let's look at the code. If we go back up here, I'm going to assume these are working correct because these are actual strings here that I'm assigning to card. Card value, remember card value is what came in, that's an integer. Well, you can't convert an integer to a string directly. You have to pass it to a function called toString. Now let's run the program. I have an 8 of clubs. No clubs here. An ace of clubs and a 5 of clubs. A lot of spades here. I'm reasonably sure everything's working now. So I'm going to quit out of here. And I'm going to modify the remainder of my switch statement down here. Now if I run it, Control F5 again. So I have 6 diamonds, 2 of spades, so it looks like it's working now. Now for testing, let's talk about testing of functions really quick. When you test a function, you want to test all possible cases of this if statement. So I want to make sure I execute line 29. I want to make sure line 31 can execute. I want to make sure line 33 can execute. And I want to make sure 35 can execute and 37 can execute. Once I've ensured every part of the if statement can be executed, I am sure of my function. Meaning I have tested my function thoroughly and I know it works correctly. Like I said, we have an assumption and a limitation. If the number passed in is greater than 13 or less than 1, it's going to return whatever the string value is of that number, which is outside the range of a deck of cards. So let's just run this one more time. 7, 7, 3, 6. So that executes the number part. I've executed king and queen. Ace, king, queen, ace. Jack, jack, queen, king, ace. So I run my program sufficiently to ensure that my function named determine num or face called value is tested sufficiently. Okay, this concludes this video on functions.